What does it take for a child's voice to cross an ocean? What kind of pain, hope, and courage must live inside a small heart for it to stand under the brightest lights in the world? Some
Please
dreams are
subscribe to our
loud.
channel.
Others are born in silence. Mateo Cruz's dream was born in a narrow street in the Philippines, where mornings smelled of rain and evenings carried the sound of distant traffic and tired prayers. He was just a child, but life had already taught him how to wait, how to observe, and how to feel things deeply without saying a word. He did not grow up surrounded by luxury or certainty. His world was simple, fragile, and often unsure. Yet, inside him lived something vast. Something that refused to stay hidden. Music found Mateo before he ever understood it. It wrapped around his quiet days and filled the empty spaces where words failed. When he sang, it was never for attention. It was as if he was releasing something he could not hold any longer. His mother, Lena Cruz, watched this from the sidelines of exhaustion. Every day tested her strength. Every night demanded faith. She carried the weight of providing and the fear of failing, but also a stubborn belief that her son's gift was not an accident. Daniel Reyes noticed it too. Not the perfection, but the truth. The raw emotion in a child who sang like he had lived many lives already. He saw something rare. Something that could either fade away quietly or rise beyond borders. Then came a moment that felt unreal. An invitation. A stage. A country far away. America's Got Talent. For Mateo, it was not just a competition. It was a leap into the unknown. A place where millions would watch, judge, and decide within seconds. A place where a small Filipino boy would carry more than a song. He would carry his mother's sacrifices. His teacher's faith. And the silent hopes of a nation that rarely gets seen, but always feels deeply. The question was no longer whether he could sing. The question was whether the world was ready to listen. Mateo Cruz was only 10 years old, but his eyes carried a quiet depth that made people pause. He was small for his age, with shoulders that seemed to lean inward, as if protecting something fragile inside him. He rarely spoke unless needed, and when he did, his voice was soft, almost careful. He lived with his mother in a modest home where space was limited but love tried its best to stretch. Mornings began early. Mateo learned to wake up without alarms, sensing time by the light slipping through thin curtains. He helped with small chores, folding clothes slowly, rinsing cups twice to make sure they were clean. School was not always easy for him. He listened more than he spoke. Other children laughed louder, ran faster, and seemed lighter somehow. Mateo often stayed on the edges, watching, thinking, feeling things he could not explain. He was not lonely, but he was often alone. Music was where his emotions found shelter. When Mateo sang, his face changed. The worry softened. The tension in his hands loosened. Singing was not something he practiced loudly. It happened quietly, in corners, on rooftops, or while washing dishes. It was never about being heard. It was about breathing. There were days when doubt crept in without warning. Days when he wondered if his voice mattered at all. He felt the weight of his mother's tired steps and the unspoken stress that lived in their home. Sometimes guilt followed him, heavy and confusing, as if dreaming was selfish. Yet, he could not stop. Mateo had a habit of closing his eyes before singing, even when no one was watching. It was his way of gathering courage. Another habit was touching the small bracelet on his wrist, a simple reminder of home and comfort. Emotionally, Mateo stood between fear and hope. Fear of being seen. Fear of falling short. Hope that maybe, just maybe, his voice could mean something beyond their small world. He did not dream of fame. He dreamed of relief. Of easing his mother's worries. Of turning sound into something useful. Something healing. At 10 years old, Mateo Cruz was not chasing applause. He was chasing a chance to be understood. The biggest struggle in Mateo Cruz's life was not his age, his voice, or even his fear of the stage. It was the quiet pressure he carried every single day without knowing how to put it down. Their life was balanced on uncertainty. Some weeks were gentle. Others felt endless. Mateo sensed this shift even when no one spoke about it. He noticed it in his mother's slower movements, in the way she counted coins carefully, in the silence that stretched longer at night. He often felt caught between love and guilt. Lena never asked him for anything, yet Mateo felt an invisible responsibility pressing against his chest. He wanted to help. He wanted to matter. But he was only a child, standing in a world that demanded strength he did not yet have. Loneliness became a familiar companion. Not the loud kind, but the soft, aching kind that follows a person even in crowded places. At school events and community gatherings, Mateo watched others shine while he stayed still, unsure where he fit. Music, once a refuge, slowly became a question. What if his voice was just a dream with no future? What if believing in it only led to disappointment? There were nights when regret arrived early. Regret for hoping. Regret for imagining a life that felt unreachable. Mateo lay awake, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, wondering if some dreams were meant to remain small. The turning point began quietly. An opportunity appeared, sudden and overwhelming. A chance that demanded courage, money, travel, and faith. It asked for things Mateo did not know how to give. It asked his mother to risk stability. It asked Mateo to step into a spotlight he had always avoided. Fear tightened its grip. The idea of leaving home, of standing alone on a foreign stage, felt heavier than failure itself. He feared disappointing his mother more than anything. He feared becoming a burden instead of a blessing. The central conflict was no longer about singing. It was about worth. Was Mateo's dream strong enough to justify the sacrifices it would require? Was his voice enough to carry not just a melody, but the weight of hope? In that emotional storm, Mateo stood still, torn between stepping forward and staying safe. And for the first time, silence felt louder than sound. The turning point did not arrive with noise or celebration. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, on a night when the power went out and the house fell into darkness. Without light, without distractions, Mateo sat near the window where the moon spilled softly onto the floor. The world outside was still. For the first time in weeks, there was no pressure to decide anything. No fear of tomorrow. Only the present moment. And in that silence, something shifted. Mateo realized that his voice had never been about winning or traveling far. It had always been about truth. About letting emotions breathe when words failed. About turning pain into something gentle. He thought of every time singing had helped him survive a hard day. Every moment it gave him strength when nothing else could. Slowly, he understood something unexpected. Even if the world never applauded, his voice already had meaning. That realization softened the fear. Soon after, events moved faster than his thoughts. Support arrived from places he did not expect. A community that once watched quietly now stood firmly behind him. Small acts of kindness came together like pieces of a puzzle. What once seemed impossible began to take shape. When Mateo finally stood on the grand stage of America's Got Talent, the lights felt blinding. The space felt endless. His small figure stood against something massive. Yet, he did not feel small. As the music began, Mateo closed his eyes, just as he always did. The stage disappeared. The judges faded. The crowd dissolved into silence. All that remained was emotion. His voice carried more than sound. It carried long nights of doubt. It carried his mother's sacrifices. It carried the quiet resilience of a child who refused to let fear define him. Something changed in the room. The audience leaned forward. The energy shifted. What they felt was not performance, but honesty. Not perfection, but vulnerability. By the final note, the silence was heavy and sacred.